Puritan John Trapp once wrote, "Reading maketh a full man, prayer a holy man, and temptation an experienced man." And it reminds us that temptation is part of Christian experience. Not a sign that anything is wrong, but a good sign that things are right. And in 1 Corinthians 10, from which we read earlier, Paul recalls the historic temptations that the people of Israel faced while travelling through the wilderness. And he alludes to them here. For instance, in verse 6, he says that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. That refers to when they craved for meat or flesh instead of the manna, and God sent them the quail, but it was not made a blessing to them. They had their heart's desire, but leanness in their souls. And then verse 7, idolaters, referring to the golden calf. When they worshipped that, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Verse 7, a quotation from Exodus 32. And then the temptation to immorality, verse 8, referring to when the people of Israel committed fornication with the Moabite women. And then also the temptation to complaining, tempting Christ, and verses 9 and 10 there, murmuring, which happened when they were weary of the way, and the fiery serpents were sent to correct them. And also on the borders of Kadesh Barnea, they murmured and complained and wanted to turn back to Egypt, and many were judged, and then they were condemned to travel for 40 years in the wilderness while that generation passed away and the next generation finally entered the promised land. The sin of murmuring and complaining of God's dealings, a very real sin against God. And Paul says that all these are representative temptations which we ourselves can face. He calls them in verse 11 ensamples, which means literally types or patterns, because Israel's experiences in temptation have important things to teach all the Lord's people, and they are instructive until the Lord returns, when we shall be tempted no more. And also he warns the self-confident, verse 12, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. To imagine that we could cope better than the people of Israel in what they faced. Great danger thinking that these are mere historical things. And Israel, well, they fell. We wouldn't do the same. Paul says, you be careful. The very time when we think we are most secure is the time when we are most in danger. And Proverbs 16:18 says that pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. There's real warning here about self-confidence. Israel, with all her privileges, the fiery cloudy pillar of his presence, fed daily with the manna, water from the flinty rock, God protecting and being with his people, the tabernacle, the worship, the glory cloud. With all these things, they nonetheless fell before temptation again and again. And if Israel did, then how is it that we will not, apart from God's grace? Be very careful. It's a good motto, isn't it, for us, verse 12? Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed, lest he fall. But then in verse 13, Paul comforts the fearful. There hath no temptation taken you, but such is common to man. But God is faithful, and so on. And this is the better spirit, to be very fearful. If Israel fell time and time again, what hope is there for me? But there is hope, because God is faithful. And what follows in this verse is a help to us. And you see how pastoral Paul is, not only warning the people, but also encouraging the people as well. So let us consider then this verse 13. As if we are Christians, we're on the pilgrimage, we're going to the promised land of heaven, and there are all these different temptations and trials to meet with on the way, but this is our help. Verse 13. Let's look first of all at the fact that we are tempted. There hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. Now this word temptation, it's important to understand that it is a two-sided word, like a coin with two sides. On the one hand, it means to experiment, to try, to test, in a bad sense. And the devil, of course, does this by bringing sin near to us to see if he can get us to yield to sin. It's enticement to evil. But the experiment, the trying, the testing, the Lord himself will do this with not so much, of course, the evil that is brought near, but the trials and the testing times to see if we will trust him and gain spiritual benefit. He did that, remember, with Abraham. Genesis 22 verse 1. After these things the Lord did tempt Abraham. He didn't tempt him to sin. He tested him to see if he would obey him in the offering up of Isaac on Mount Moriah. It was a temptation, but in the form of trial to prove Abraham's love for God beyond even that of his son. In James 1, the opening verses, count it all joy, my brethren, when ye fall into divers temptations. It doesn't mean temptations to sin, but divers trials and things that will put you to the test and prove where your trust is and where your strength is, where your weakness is. And so temptation has this double meaning. When the devil is there in it, is to bring the worst out in us, hopefully, as far as he's concerned. When the Lord is at work by it, is to bring the best out in us and to prove the grace of God. But it can, of course, be two things happening at the same time. We can be tempted to sin, and yet God is there to try us and to see if we're going to resist it in his strength and look to him for being kept. So it's that operation whereby the devil is at work, but the Lord is at work as well. So this temptation then. Now notice how it comes. Temptation taken you. It sometimes comes to seize us, doesn't it? come all of a sudden, and we find ourselves in its grip. Whether it's enticement to sin, or trying circumstances to prove us, there is a sovereignty in these things. And the suddenness sometimes surprises us, doesn't it? We can be going along quite peacefully and encouragingly, and we can meet with something all of a sudden, and it takes us. Whether a sinful thing that would draw the worst out in us unless God keeps us, or a sudden trial and affliction which demands our response, trusting in God, looking to Him, proving His faithfulness, the Lord's wise dealings in these things. Now, we never know when it may happen. Taken you. That's why you see it's so foolish to feel self-confident, isn't it? The Apostle Peter was guilty of that, wasn't he? So confident he was that he'd be faithful to the Lord, even if the other disciples failed him. But Satan was going to sift him. And so there was that temptation to sin in denial. But there was that call to trust in the Lord. And Jesus was praying for him. And we know what happened, but we know he was recovered. But there can be that suddenness. And the Lord Jesus in Matthew 6, the Lord's Prayer, encourages us that we might be spared, if possible, to pray, lead us not into temptation. It would be on the whole better that we might be spared it, because there is potential for sin, even though there's potential for good as well. But we shouldn't look for it. We shouldn't want it. It's something better to be done without, really. But sometimes it is God's will that it takes us, and we are in its hold, and we are sometimes overcome a little. But when it comes, notice, there hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. In other words, it's the common lot of every Christian. We tend to think sometimes perhaps our temptation / trial is like no one else's. No one is tempted like me. My besetting sin. Oh, the devil, so cunning, so strong. Don't believe it. It's common to man. Oh, there's no trial like my trial. What I'm suffering, my affliction, my grief, my sorrow. Don't believe it. It's common to man. In 1 Peter 5 and verse 9, the apostle encourages believers not to think that they're unique in this, knowing that the same afflictions are accomplished in your brethren that are in the world. And that's why it is so good to have such a quality of Christian fellowship with each other, that we are able to open up and share at this level, and to be able to say, I've got this real problem that the Lord in His sovereignty is allowing to happen, that the devil is coming to me in this way. And then you find that the person you're talking to, your fellow Christian, says, well, you know, that's amazing, that's quite similar to mine as well. And you say, oh, is it? Well, that's a great comfort to know I'm not on my own in this. Common to man. And that's why you see it is so wrong to give the impression to fellow Christians that all is well, that I don't have any problems with temptation, that I can go through life and I'm untroubled by the devil. My corruptions, well, they're lying low and quiet, and grace reigns in my heart, and all continues well. If anyone says that, that's a very suspicious condition to be in. It's not common to man according to the Bible. Or if someone says, well, you know, I never have any problems in life. All is running smoothly and swimmingly. And you say, are they? Well, that's remarkable. That doesn't seem to be what the Bible teaches. Temptation taken you, common to man. It's the same for us all. What a great comfort that is. It's not a right kind of approach to give the impression that Christians should always be smiling and always give the impression that they're on a victory course and that things are going so well, that they're getting the better of every temptation, every problem. Nothing besets them, nothing defeats them. Oh, what a depressing thing that would be for the rest of us. No, it's common to man. Even God's incarnate Son, the Lord Jesus, did he not suffer temptation? Matthew Henry said, God had one Son without sin, but no Son without temptation. None of us can afford to be without this. And if your particular temptation, if it's what it is, well then that's what God has appointed. It could have been something else, but it's what the Lord deals with us over, common to us. The Lord knows what he's doing in his sovereignty. So these are not unusual dealings, and they become a proving experience. You think again of Israel in the wilderness, who are examples of this to us. In Deuteronomy 8 and verse 2, the Lord, through Moses, speaks to Israel and looks back upon their experiences through the wilderness, now that they are on the borders of the promised land. And we read this, Deuteronomy 8 verse 2, Thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldst keep his commandments or no. And he humbled thee, and suffered thee to hunger, and fed thee with manna, and so on. Verse 16, who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee, and prove thee, to do thee good at thy latter end. So you see, these things are for good. How else is it that our particular areas of weakness can be discovered? How is it that our particular areas of strength by God's grace can be manifested? Unless we are put to the test. Think of it like this. I know we wouldn't do this, but think of it like this. Here is a dog, and there's a nice juicy lump of meat put on the ground in front of the dog. And its owner says, don't touch that meat. And the dog sits there, and the saliva begins to run in its mouth, and his eyes are wide open on this bit of meat. Now you see, it's both a temptation and a trial, isn't it? Because everything in that dog just longs to get its jaws around that lump of meat. But it would be wrong to do so, because the owner has said no. It's a temptation though. But it's a trial as well, because will the dog resist to please the master, rather than to gratify its desire for the meat? And isn't it proving the dog? And in a similar way in principle, you see. Temptation to sin, trials and afflictions, they have a proving effect. Will we yield? Instead of calling upon God for grace to resist, will we trust God in that difficult, almost impossible situation? It's a proving experience. And so it can bring out the best, or it can bring out the worst. You think of Joseph, for instance, going further back than Israel. Here was a case where this young man, he both was tempted and he was tried, wasn't he? He was tempted with Potiphar's wife. Severe temptation. But by grace, he called upon the Lord inwardly, surely, and was able to say outwardly, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And didn't that prove his godliness and his fortitude by grace? But then the rest of his experience, it was such a trial, wasn't it? The way his brothers treated him, the way he was sold as a slave to Egypt and was doing menial work in Potiphar's house, and then imprisoned falsely, and afterwards, oh, the trial, and the way he graciously dealt with his brothers, though, all this showed the grace of his character. You wouldn't have admired Joseph as such a godly man if it hadn't been for the things he went through. His life story in the book of Genesis would not be so profitable to us had he not experienced these things. And so you see, it was a proving experience. You think of David again. King David, again the temptation with Bathsheba and Uriah, fell terribly, although graciously and wonderfully recovered. But then the trial with Saul, persecution, and then all the enemies afterwards, and yet those wonderful psalms and all the benefit and the good of it. It can bring out the best or it can bring out the worst. It's a proving of what we are, where we are, how we are. These things, the temptation taking us, but common to man. And so we are tempted, dear friends. It's a fact of life. But let's look secondly, not only that we are tempted, but God is gracious. God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation make a way to escape that ye may be able to bear it. Now, the faithfulness of God behind all this. You see, the fact is, he is dedicated to our good. Not our ease, but our profit. God is faithful. And how does he show that faithfulness in our temptations? Well, he controls them. He will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able. It's telling us that though severe they may be, he will never allow them to be too much for us or too great for us. He sets a bound to every temptation stroke trial, never too fierce or too many or for too long. Never the last straw. You think of Isaiah 43 and verse 2. When thou passest through the waters, they shall not overflow thee. I will be with thee. There was someone who was quoting this verse to someone in their need. And it was a wonderful thing that someone was literally passing through the waters of death, the waters of Jordan. And the minister was at the bedside of this saint, and he was quoting these words, "When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers they shall not overflow thee." And the person said, not so much the waters, but his presence. That's what he knew. Because the Lord sets a bound, and the Lord comes in, and it's never too much. So much more, dear friends, that does not come, even though it seems a great deal. There is that which God in his faithfulness will not suffer us to be tempted above that ye are able. He knows how much we can bear, and he gives us the grace to bear it. And you see, look, the way of safety, but will with the temptation make the way of escape. Something always comes with it for our help. And that explains why it's never too much. It's like an escape route. We'll make a way to escape. There is a relief available. It puts me in mind of a certain hill in North Devon called Lynmouth Hill. It goes down to a pretty coastal village called Lynmouth, but the hill is so steep because the terrain of that part is so hilly, it's been called the Switzerland of North Devon because it's up and down, and this hill is a 25% gradient, 1 in 4, so steep. It's a grueling experience for cyclists, either going up or going down. But it's also a danger for motorists, because if you're going down the hill and your brakes fail, what then? But they have made what they call escape roads on the way down. It's not really much of a road, but on the left there, as you're going down the hill, there is a cutout, and it runs for a little while, and it's all sand, so that if your brakes should fail and you're really going downhill out of control, all you've got to do is turn to the left and you'll hit this sand and come to a halt. Now that's the way of escape. And God has made that way of escape in every temptation, every trial. Look for it, dear friends. It's there. That's why you'll never be completely overwhelmed. It'll never be such that it will crush you and you can't bear it any longer. It's the faithfulness of God that promises that with the temptation, he will make a way to escape. That's why in Matthew 6 verse 13 you see, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. The way of escape. If something is so heavy upon you at this time, if something is almost unbearable, too much, if something becomes such that you can't see any hope, any prospect, any solution, any resolving of it, look for that way of escape. Do you think that the local authorities of Lynmouth, in their kindness to motorists, providing that way of escape so that you don't have a terrible crash in your car, do you think that they're kinder than the living God is for his children with his escape roads? The way of escape. And the way it works is this: we will either be delivered in the temptation, or we'll be delivered out of the temptation. Now, if we're delivered in the temptation, if the way of escape is that way, it will be that the Lord will strengthen us to go through it. Like the Apostle Paul, with his thorn in the flesh. It wasn't that he was to be delivered from it, but my grace is sufficient for thee. My strength is made perfect in weakness. So that the thorn wasn't removed, but the being too much was removed, so that he had the way of escape in the grace of God. And Paul could say, when I'm weak, then am I strong. I glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ might rest upon me. You see, there's deliverance in it. Triumph, victory over it. By the grace of God, he had that way of escape. The grace of God gave him relief and help, and he could testify that it was sufficient. That may be how it is. Daily strength for daily need. Wonderful support under the great weight of the trial. Marvelous preservation in the temptations that come. Temptation to sin in thought, in word, in deed. The way of escape. Or it might be deliverance from the temptation. In other words, sometimes God just takes the thing out of our hands, or takes us out of it most wonderfully. 2 Peter 2 verse 9, the Lord knoweth how to deliver the godly out of temptations. The story it's told of a widow lady called Elizabeth Chadsey. It comes from Victorian times. Times were a lot harder in those days. But she lost her husband, and not long after her husband's burial, the bailiff came to her house and said, Mrs. Chadsey, you are in debt to your landlord, and he has sent me to demand the rent that is due to him. And this godly woman, she answered, Sir, I have not so much money in the world. Indeed, I have none at all. But, said he, have you nothing that will fetch money? She replied, Sir, you see that all I have is nothing in this house but these 6 little children. Then said he, I must execute my writ and carry you to Newgate prison. But it is a hard case. I will leave you here till tomorrow, and will go and try if I cannot persuade your landlord to give you time. He returned the next morning and said, I have done all I can. I have used all the arguments I could think of, but your landlord is not to be moved. He vows, if I do not carry you to prison without delay, I shall go thither myself. She answered, you have done your part. The will of the Lord be done. He said, I will venture to make one more trial, and will come again in the morning. He came in the morning and said, Mrs. Chadsey, God has undertaken your cause. None can give you any trouble now, for your landlord died last night. Delivered from. Look for the way to escape. The escape road. It's there. As surely as the temptation is there. And so here is the victory. That ye might be able to bear it. The Apostle Paul again in 2 Corinthians 1, verses 8 to 10, he puts it like this. In his language it shows that this was true in his experience, where he says, we would not, brethren, have you ignorant of our trouble, which came to us in Asia, that we were pressed out of measure, above strength, insomuch that we despaired even of life. But we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God which raiseth the dead, who delivered us from so great a death, and doth deliver, in whom we trust that he will yet deliver us. We don't know what this great trial was, but it was certainly something that was that temptation that took him, but God showed his faithfulness. Oh, we are tempted, dear friends. It's part of the pilgrimage, the journey to heaven, that we should be so. But God is gracious, greater than all temptation, faithful, able to curb and restrict and confine, so that we are given that way to escape, that we may be able to bear it. And dear friends, what could Israel have known if she had, instead of committing idolatry, instead of lusting after flesh and meat, instead of complaining, instead of these things that characterize them throughout their wilderness journey, if they had only looked to the Lord who was in their midst, if they had put their confidence in He who was there in that pillar of cloud by day and pillar of fire by night, accessible through the tabernacle, the priests, the sacrifices, with them in the midst, could have been so different, couldn't it? They wouldn't have fallen, been judged, consigned to that wilderness whereby the present generation died and the next generation lived to enter the promised land. What might have been? And dear friends, what may it be for us? We are tempted, God is gracious, but may we prove His great faithfulness and be graciously helped through all our days to the end and to heaven and to glory. May it be so for His name's sake. Amen.